What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. Today we're going to be looking at one of my oldest commanders, Muldrotha, and then upgrading it because she's gotten a ton of tech, so we're going to utilize that to make her busted. But before we get into that, let's shout out the patrons. Irrelevant, you rock. Additionally, if you guys want a free $15, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You get some free money, it helps out the channel. Additionally, if you want to help out the channel, you can always like, comment, and subscribe if you are enjoying the content. Now, let's get right into what this Muldrotha deck wants to do and the overall pluses of running Muldrotha as a commander. This girl is the toolbox commander in my opinion. She just gets to reanimate all the permanent cards from your graveyard, and we're playing some broken ones like Pernicious Deeds, right? We've got a repeatable board wipe that can just get rid of our opponent's boards. Additionally, there's a ton of creatures that just sacrifice themselves and you get value out of them. Whether they give you a land card whenever they sacrifice themselves, whether they destroy an artifact or enchantment, either way, you're getting a ton of value. This is one of those decks, once the engine is online, it's really your game to lose. The only problem is getting that engine online, right? So we are going to focus on the early game ramp so we can get that expensive commander on the battlefield. Additionally, this is sort of a secret commander deck in the sense that I want to get the Scarab God on the battlefield as soon as possible and start reanimating our opponent's creatures. I kind of did pair this with a Seedborn Muse Scarab God strategy. That way we can get a ton of zombies on the battlefield, hopefully get some broken creature cards from our opponent's graveyards, and then eventually just control the entire board and win the game. We do have a lot of mill effects, some new ones from new sets that we're going to utilize, and additionally we have other cards that just mill all of our opponents a ton. That way we always have targets for the Scarab God. Additionally, we got the new Gisa, which again, committing the crime does in fact work with Scarab God's ability, so now we're getting like 3 zombies every time we activate Scarab God's ability. That's not okay. Additionally, the new Geralt kind of works with Muldrotha because it's kind of a stormy commander. We're trying to get as much value out of Muldrotha as possible, so we're going to try to cast as many typings from the graveyard as possible every single turn. So, if that sounds like a deck tech you guys want to get into, let's get into it. Oh, also Insidious Roots, just not okay here. It's not going to be alright. We're going to kick this deck tech off a little bit differently, and we're just going to talk about the new cards we've gotten over these past couple years that I think Muldrotha is really going to abuse. The first one is Out of the Tombs. Not only is this very efficient mill that puts a ton of cards into our graveyard, it also ensures that if we ever actually do run out of our library, that this actually turns into a win con and prevents us from losing the game. Now, whenever a creature enters the battlefield and we have a card draw effect like the Great Henge, it's just going to allow us to reanimate all the creatures in our graveyard. And then as long as we have a sack outlet, we can kind of get infinite die triggers, infinite ETBs, and do some pretty messed up stuff that we're going to talk about later. Another card that I really like shoving in this deck is Staff of Completion. The fact that this is able to destroy a target permanent is pretty massive whenever we're playing stuff like the Meat Hook Massacre. Now we're able to destroy it, it goes back into our graveyard, and we can recast it to get a repeatable board wipe that gives us constant value. The Meat Hook Massacre is also just pretty useful here for its drain ability. And then again, if we ever do run out of our entire library with Out of the Tombs on the battlefield, this can just win us the game with the infinite die triggers, so we definitely love that. Warren Soul Trader is just super busted. It's becoming one of my favorite sack outlets because it just turns the creatures you sacrifice into mana, but stored mana. So instead of something like an Ashnod's Altar where you get the mana right away, we can store this mana in the form of treasure tokens, which is extremely busted. I'm also in love with Ripples of Undeath. I've been shoving this in absolutely every single graveyard deck I've been brewing lately just because of how amazing it feels to play turn 2. Even if you do mill something you need like another land, you can always pay that life and put it into your hand instead of the graveyard. So you're just rifling through your library, finding all the key pieces you need. The Wise Mothman is also going to be pretty cool to add here along with the Master. Both of these are going to pair very perfectly with the strategy to mill out our opponents and then additionally reanimate our opponent's creatures. The Master also really synergizes with something like a Seedborn Muse where it's untapping every turn, and then as long as we have something like Mesmeric Orb on the battlefield constantly milling our opponents, we can ensure that there's always going to be a target for the Master to reanimate. So these cards I'm really excited to add to this deck as well. Gisa and the new Geralt also perfect here. Remember, whenever we target a card in our opponent's graveyard, that is committing a crime, so we are going to get those zombies off of of Gisa. Additionally, Geralf is just perfect with Muldrotha. This is kind of a stormy strategy, not storm in the sense that we want to cast, 10, 20 cards a turn, but storm in the sense that we're trying to cast 4 to 3 cards very consistently every turn to generate a lot of value. Insidious Roots is also just not okay here. Whenever we're exiling the cards from our own graveyard using the Scarab God, this is going to allow us to generate mana dorks. Additionally, whenever we're just straight up casting anything from our graveyard, it's also going to generate even more mana dorks. So if we're able to pair that with Tyvar, it's going to allow us to use those mana dorks immediately, and it just makes for some really busted board states where we have a massive board of plant tokens that can tap for mana. And then again, you pair this with the Seedborn Muse strategy along with the Scarab God, and we have limitless mana. Mindskinner is also a card I'm super excited to try. Muldrotha is a 6/6, and this is a 10/1 that can't be blocked, right? So with our commander and the Mindskinner, we can mill up to 6 cards consistently every turn. Gonna be pretty busted. It's gonna fill our opponent's graveyards, and again, allow us to get a ton of Scarab God and the Master targets. Another card that I'm really excited to add to this deck is Braids. Braids is going to be perfect here just for some solid card advantage. Start sacrificing lands with Braids, and 9 times out of 10, you're just going to straight up draw 3 cards. Turns out your opponents really dislike sacrificing lands. Speaking of lands, Shifting Woodlands is going to be amazing. This can just be any key card that's in our graveyard. We can go ahead and turn Shifting Woodlands into it, and now we've got a powerful piece to hopefully win the game. Aftermath Analysis is also a card I'm pretty excited about here. This is a creature that enters the battlefield, and when it enters, it mills 3 cards. Then we can sacrifice it for 4 mana and turn all of the land cards from our graveyard onto the battlefield. I'm a really big fan of this because this is something you're not going to want to do every single turn, which Muldrotha needs a little bit of, right? We don't want one creature that we want to bring onto the board consistently every time. If every creature wants to be that creature, then you're going to run into a deck building problem where you end up with 3 of those in the graveyard, but you can only reanimate 1 per turn, right? So I like the fact that we can include creatures like Aftermath Analysis that you wouldn't want to reanimate every single turn, but it's really good every maybe 3 turns, right? Just get a ton of lands on the battlefield all at once. Invasion of Ikoria is also pretty funny here because it's a tutor that we get to cast from our graveyard, and then once we flip this and turn this into a giant dinosaur, we can actually just sacrifice the dinosaur to recast a tutor from our graveyard. So you can either keep the 8/8 giant dinosaur that kind of makes your creatures unblockable, or you sacrifice it, get some value, and you get another tutor. Just a very flexible card that's kind of busted in Muldrotha. The Great Door is also another card that I'm super excited to add to this deck. It's just a 3 mana artifact that's going to allow us to draw a card and discard a card. And then once we get enough card types in our graveyard, we can flip this over, and it's going to actually tap for mana equal to the amount of permanent cards in our graveyard. So this is going to be responsible for adding a ton of mana to our mana pool. Don't forget, we have a lot of amazing mana sinks in the form of the Scarab God and even Kennen Bonner Prodigy. Now, whenever we're activating any of these, we're getting value off of the massive amount of mana we are generating with this card. And then additionally, in the early game, it's just super solid. It's kind of like card draw because you're discarding what you're going to cast from the graveyard later in exchange for something that's going to be useful to you right now. Doc Arlock seems like he's going to be an all-star in these Muldrotha strategies. Now, he is only good once we get Muldrotha online, but once we do get Muldrotha online, reducing the cost of all of the cards we're casting from our graveyard by 2 is massive. Last but not least, we have Shigeki. I put this in all my other graveyard decks, and I'm super excited to add it to my oldest graveyard deck. The value here is just insane, and additionally, we can actually channel this guy, returning something from our graveyard to our hand, and then cast him from the graveyard. Plus, he has dual typing, so that's super flexible with Muldrotha's ability. We can either have him be the enchantment per turn or the creature per turn. He doesn't take both of those slots up, which is amazing. Moving on to our next category, I want to talk about the staples of this deck. These are going to be the cards that overperform. Again, I've had this deck in paper for a while, so I just want to talk about the cards that really hold their own. The first one is obviously Buried Alive. My favorite thing to grab with this card is Biomancer's Familiar, the Scarab God, and Seedborn Muse. Now we have everything we need to get our value engine online in our graveyard. Now it does take a little bit after that because these are all creature cards, so you have to do them once per turn, which feels kind of bad, but again, it gets the ball rolling and everything you need in the graveyard. I will say this does get sped up a lot if you have any of the reanimators that are enchantments already in your graveyard, so then right away you can cast something like the Scarab God and then instantly reanimate Seedborn Muse, and boom, you're doing the thing. Having these 3 cards on the battlefield has single-handedly made me untap with over 20 zombies and drain the table for 20 life while scrying 20 cards. It's absolutely insane. The next card that definitely overperforms in this deck is Oko. This guy's super annoying, so everybody tries to get him off the board as soon as possible. The only problem is with Muldrotha, we're just going to recast him from the graveyard and he's going to continue turning your entire board into Elks. Mindcrank is also absolutely broken in this deck. Now, I actually did end up taking Sir Conrad out of this deck because Mindcrank and Sir Conrad is just not okay. So if you're looking for another combo-y aspect to add to this deck, you could add Sir Conrad and that's just going to be disgusting. But because I wanted this to be a secret commander deck, I didn't want a, hey, this is always the best choice. The best choice was always to get Mindcrank in the graveyard and Sir Conrad. That's not what I want here. I want the best choice to always be the Scarab God. So we went ahead and cut him out of the deck. Pernicious Deeds also does some pretty messed up stuff here. This is a board wipe that actually allows you to choose what X is going to be, right? And then you destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with converted mana cost X or less. What's amazing about this card is Muldrotha has a very high CMC, and we're able to cast permanent cards from our graveyard, right? This means we can activate Pernicious Deed for 5, keep our very important commander, and then recast it from our graveyard and all of our other value pieces from the graveyard as well. So we're able to rebuild way faster than our opponents, and we're most likely wiping out their entire board with this. Another really cool thing about Pernicious Deeds is you can actually activate it for 0, and that's just going to get rid of all tokens right away. This might sound like a Nombo with the Scarab God because sacrificing it for 0 is going to get rid of all tokens with 0 CMC. The cool thing about the Scarab God is those tokens are actually going to have CMC because we're actually creating a token copy of that creature. So whenever you're making a token copy of that creature, we're actually copying the CMC as well. So these tokens will have CMC and their CMC will not be 0. Tormod the Desecrated just makes a massive board very quickly. It also synergizes really well with the Scarab God. Again, this can get some massive drain happening in addition to scrying through your entire deck very fast. Just generic value pieces, you have the Gitrog monster and even Jace's Archivist and Secrets of the Dead. I like these cards because they're just amazing card advantage, and even Jace's Archivist is going to be very useful at milling our opponents to an oblivion, especially if we have something like Seedborn Muse on the battlefield and we're able to activate this up to 4 times a rotation. That just gets everybody's graveyard very fat very quickly. Speaking of everybody's graveyard getting fat quickly, we have Mesmeric Orb. Now every time they untap something, they're putting something in their graveyard. Glenalindra Archmage, Kaya's Ghost Form, Siren Storm Tamer, and Spellskite are all going to be amazing ways to protect our key pieces. These sit on the battlefield and kind of just dare our opponents to do something, but they're never going to. The thing about these is they kind of play a mind game, right? They know if they go to remove Muldrotha, I'm just going to counter it, so then they just don't end up even trying to remove Muldrotha. So it's kind of like a stacks piece almost, and these just get to sit on the battlefield for free. 9 times out of 10, right? Another one of my favorite wombo combos, so to speak, is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, and Greater Good. What's going to happen here is we're just going to cast Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, over and over again from our graveyard, and then sacrifice it to Greater Good before we have to sacrifice it to its escape trigger, right? And then we just get to get a ton of value, draw a ton of cards, put lands into play, and even we get to discard more cards into our graveyard. We can even use something like Altar of Dementia to sacrifice him to generate a ton of value as well. I'm absolutely in love with this guy. The only thing is you do just have to respond to his escape trigger trying to sacrifice him, because we're not escaping him, we're just straight up casting this guy. Another card I really wanted to cover was the Glowing One. I've absolutely loved this deck in my mill strategies, especially strategies where I'm trying to mill out my opponents as well, because this just gains you an insane amount of life. I really wasn't expecting it to, but honestly, it's kind of insane. You kind of become unkillable once you get something like a Mesmeric Orb on the battlefield. You just mill them to oblivion. Even something like Mothman is kind of crazy here. You just gain an insane amount of life very quickly, and it's going to make you hard to kill, which is just going to help you get to the late game. And once you make it to the late game with Muldrotha, you're really hard to stop. With that being said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this deck tech. I really had a lot of fun upgrading this older commander that I love so much, and I think it's just a well-rounded, solid deck, and I'm excited to play it against my playgroup. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comments down below. Now let's shout out those patrons. The Professional Heal, Irrelevant, Chicken Salad, Creator, and Excessum. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped you guys in your deck building endeavors, and I'll see you guys in the next one.